Hi there. In this video, you will learn to create an amazing full stack application which will be used to show, add, delete, and update notes. This will be a great learning experience, and in this one, we will create a backend API using ASP.NET Core and use Entity Framework Core to persist our data. We will also create a front-end client using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we will tie both these applications together to create a wonderful full-stack web application. If you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more free content like this one in future. With that said, let's start coding. I have a new folder created for myself, which is called Notes app with ASP.NET Core, Web API, and JavaScript. And in here, I will create my ASP.NET Core Web API. So I will open Visual Studio, and then I will click on Create a New Project. In here, I can choose the ASP.NET Core Web API template and click Next. And here, I will choose the location where I want to create this first. So I will paste it here, and then I will give the name of the project. So I will call this notes.api, and the solution name can be just notes, and click Next. The version I'm selecting here is the latest version, which is .NET 6, and I'll keep the options as the same, and I will click on the create button. Because we want to make use of Entity Framework Core to talk to our database to save, fetch, and update and delete the notes of our application. So we want to install some dependencies first, and we want to install some NuGet packages. To do that, right click on the dependencies and click on Manage NuGet Packages. And the two NuGet packages I want to install are these two. So I will first select this one, which is Microsoft.EF Core SQL Server. On the Browse tab, I will come over here and search for it and click and install the latest version. And I will also copy the second one, which is responsible to actually create the database for us, which is the tools. And this actually runs Entity Framework Core migrations. So I will again search for this one and install the latest version. Now that we have installed the two packages, it's now time to create the domain models for our application. We are creating a notes application, so we want to create a note entity which is responsible for saving the data for the individual notes that we want to save from our application. So inside our application, I will create a new folder called models. And then inside models, I will create another folder called entities. Entities are basically anything, any domain model with an ID. And because these individual notes that we are going to save will each carry an ID, that's why they're classified as an entity. So in here, I will create a new class, and I will call that note. Now we are going to add some properties to our domain model, which is note. And the first thing we want is the ID. So we want an ID of type GUID, and which will be the unique identifier for our note. The next field we want is the title property, which will hold the title for the note, and it is of type string. The third one would be description, which will hold the long text of the note, and that's of string again. And the final and the fourth one would be the isVisible property, which is a type of Boolean, which will basically say, is this visible to the UI client of our application or not? So these four properties we are going to persist in our database, and we are going to fetch it from our JavaScript client. So it's now time to add a DbContext, and because we are using Entity Framework, DbContext acts as a way to fetch data from the database, and because DbContext is a way to connect to our database using Entity Framework Core. So let's add that. I will come over here and I will create a new folder called data. And inside here, I will create my DbContext, and I will give it a name of, let's say, notes DbContext. this will basically inherit from DbContext. And if you click control dot to import the dependency, and we will use Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And if you come over here to the notes DbContext and you press control dot again, you can basically generate the constructor with this options one. So basically we have the constructor which we can pass options to, and that will pass options to the base class. And after that, we want to have properties to this notes DbContext, which will act like a way so that we can talk to our tables in a SQL Server database or any other database. And the way we do it in Entity Framework is by using properties. So prop, and now we will create a dbSet type of property. So dbSet, and this takes a type, and the type of our property will be a note type. So a note, and control dot to use this from entities, and the name of the table or the property will be notes. So this will act as an interface to using our notes table, so that we can create, read, update, and delete our notes, individual notes. So now we have the DbContext. It's now time to add a connection inside the app settings.json to this new database that we want to create. And so let's go inside the app settings.json, and in here we want to create a connection strings property, and inside that it will have a key value pair. This will be the connection string for the notes application. So I will say notes db connection string colon. Now it has to take the actual connection to the database. So I will start with the server. It actually follows this pattern. So you have to give the server, which in my case it's this, but it can be a different server of what you have installed in your machine. The database that we want to create is notesdb. Yours could be totally different, and we want to specify trusted connection equal to true. So I'll copy this and paste it over here. So we have a key value pair of the connection string that we want to use and the value of the connection string. So we will use this inside the program.cs, and we will inject this using dependency injection. So I will open my program.cs file, and we are basically injecting this inside the di container of our application. And I will say builder.services.add DbContext, and it takes a type. So the type of our DbContext is notes DbContext. Control dot to pull in the dependencies, and it takes options. So I will specify options such that options dot, and I want to specify what type of a database you want to use. And because we installed the SQL Server package from NuGet, I want to use the SQL Server database. So I will say use SQL Server, control dot to pull in the dependency using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And if we open the brackets for this one, it basically takes a connection string as a string property, and we have defined our connection string which is inside the app settings.json over here. So I will pull this inside program.cs file, and I will push this to the second line, and I will call the builder again dot configuration. Builder dot configuration. And if I open the brackets, the square brackets, I can specify the key, which is the connection strings dot this, or I can also say configuration dot get connection string, and this will automatically, if I tell it the name of the connection string, it will automatically give me the value of it. So the name of my connection string is this. Yours could be totally different. So copy the one that you have defined in your app settings.json. So coming back to my program.cs file, I will paste that over here. And this way we have injected our DbContext inside the services of our DI container of our ASP.NET Core app. So now we have done all the setup for creating our database using Entity Framework Core, and it's now time to use that second package that we installed, which was the tools package, to actually run EF Core migrations. To do that, I will come to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager Console. And over here, I will specify two commands. The first one will be add-migration, and after that I will give a space, and inside the double quotes I will specify some text that identifies this migration. This will be the first migration, so I can say initial migration, and I will copy that and paste it over here and press enter. So this is creating a migration for us so that Entity Framework can use this migration to update our database. So it's basically, once it has done it, it basically creates a set of C# commands for creating a database and the table that it wants to create. So it has created a new folder over here called migrations, and inside that you can see the initial migration that we created, and it has an up and down command, and mostly the up command is what gets executed to actually add the data. So it will create a new table called notes, and these are the 4 fields that we want to create inside it. So after the first step, which is add migration, the second step that we want to do is to update the database. So update -database. So copy that and paste it. Before entering over here, before running this command, I want to show you that there's nothing over here. This is my SQL Server, SSMS, and if I refresh my server, I don't have any database called notesdb. So I will now run this command, and this will basically use this migration file over here and create the database for us. So this has been successfully executed, and if I come back and I refresh the server again, expand databases, you can see that the new database has been created. And if I expand on that, under the tables, I should only have one table. This is the migration history table, but other than that we have the notes table, which has 4 columns, the ID, title, description, and is visible, the ones that we created inside our entity. So everything from the database side has been done. It's now time to use this DbContext to actually make CRUD operations, and like create, read, update, and delete calls. And after that, we will create our JavaScript client. So the groundwork for setting up Entity Framework Core and creating the database has been done. We can actually close these files now, and it's now time to create a new API call. And for that, we will create our own controller, because we already have an existing controller, but we will create our own. So I will come over here, right click on controllers, add a new controller, and I will go ahead with the MVC controller empty, click on add, and I will give a name to this controller. So let's say I will call this the notes controller, click on add. The first thing I will do after after this controller has been created is I will annotate this controller with the attribute of API controller, telling that this is an API controller and it won't be having any views. So it will just pass data back to our clients. And I will remove this method, so it's a fresh start. And I will also add a route parameter of what route would actually get mapped to this controller, and I will say route, and in double quotes I will say this will go to API / the name of the controller. So you can either mention it inside these square brackets, and by doing that it will automatically takes the name of the controller, which is notes, or you can specify it using actual text. They both are the same, so I will use the brackets. It's now time to create the first action method, which is to get all the notes from the database. So to do that, I will create my first action method, public, and I will create an async method. So async task of I action result, and I will call this get all notes. And this will be an HTTP get method because it's fetching results. So HTTP get, and it won't be annotated with any route, because when the user goes to API/notes, it should be able to get all the notes. That's how REST APIs work, and that's how they are defined. The routes for REST APIs are defined. So in here, I want to somehow get the notes from the database. And we know how we can get the notes from the database. We have to make use of the notes DbContext, which we have injected in the services. So it's now time to use that injection. And we will make use of constructor injection. So I will create a constructor for this controller using CTOR tab, and then I will inject the DB context inside here. So notes DbContext control dot import the dependencies. You can call it DbContext or notes DbContext, anything is fine. And using control dot, I will create a local private read-only property so that I can use it inside my actions. Now I can use this notes DbContext to actually call the notes table, which is a property of the DbContext, because we defined it as a property over here, like the DB set. And then I want to actually get all of it. So one way you can do it, because it's an async method, you can actually use the toList async. It's not coming straight out of the box, but if you do a control dot, we have to import this package, Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and it has the extension of the toList async. And because we are using an async method, we have to use the await keyword. And we can simply return the result back to our client. And it's throwing me an error because it's an I action result. So we can say, we can wrap this inside an OK response, which is a 200 response. So if you know about a REST API, 200 status, HTTP statuses means it's a success response. We have created our first method, which gets all the notes. So now it's time to create our second method, which only gets you the single note by ID, because that's the unique identifier. So I can either copy paste all of it and make changes, or I'll just create my another one from scratch. So it's in HTTP get method, and I will also give a route, because this one needs to have an ID in the route. Again, RESTful principles. So the route for this one would have in a string an ID. So after we are going to API/controller name / the ID. So basically that will be the single resource of notes, and it will fetch me the single note as well from the database. And to bind this, I can say it's of type GUID, and we will do that in just a second. After that, we will say public async task of type I action result, and I can say get note by ID. So now this method needs something to search the database, right? It needs to have an ID so that it can search the database for that ID. So the ID that's stored in our application is of type GUID, so we will accept GUIDs. The name is ID. The name here should match the name in the ID, so that it can actually bind the value that is coming in the route to the value inside our parameter of the function. You can also specify that this is coming from the route. It's optional for at the moment for this function, but you can still be clear that this value is coming from the route. And to make it type safe, we can actually use the keyword GUID after a semicolon, a colon, and that will basically mean that this ID becomes type safe. And in Swagger, you'll actually see that you can't pass any other invalid value. You'll have to pass a GUID. So in here, in the get node by ID, we'll again make use of the context to make a call to the database and see if we are getting anything or not. So I'll say await notes DbContext dot notes dot first or default. I'll use the async method because I can. It's available to us. So I'll use the first or default async. And I can say x such that x dot id is equal to the ID that is getting passed inside the function. We can use this, or there's another way. We can say await notes DbContext dot notes dot find async. So we have a way we can find the resource by the unique identifier. So if I open the brackets, it should take the param. So if I say find, it takes the object key value pairs, which is the primary key value. So find async also takes the ID. So I can pass the ID to this like that, and it basically tries to find the notes table for this unique identifier. So we can use this or this. I prefer this one, which is more efficient. So I'll remove the other one or just comment it so that you guys can see it. And I'll store this in a variable. So I'll say variable note is this. I'll first check if the note is null. That means it's not available to us. It was a wrong GUID. We are unable to find that in our database. So I will return a not found back to the user and let the client handle it. Otherwise, we are going to return the note back to our client application, which is the JavaScript application in this case, wrapped inside the OK response. So we have implemented two methods, which is the get all notes and the get note. Now it's time to implement the rest of the three, which is add, update, and delete. So first we'll start with the add, which is an HTTP post method. If you follow RESTful principles, the route would be the same as the base route of the controller because it's a post on the notes. So that remains the same. So there's no extra route added to it. I will create the method public async task of type iActionResult, and I will call this add note. And to the add note, I can get the parameters or basically the entity that we want to store inside the database. So in the method, I will call note from models.entities, and the variable name would be note. In here, I will then, because we don't want to get the ID of the note field from our client, we want to create it ourselves. I will say note.id is equal to a new GUID, so that we are overriding it with something that we are creating, we as an API are creating, and not the client. And after that, Visual Studio is smart enough to suggest me that we want to add a new note. So I will use this. I'm using the notes dbcontext.notes.add async and passing the note field, the note entity to this. So this will create us the value of the notes inside our database, but it won't persist because we still have to call the save changes async. So let's do that. Let's use the notes DbContext again to save our changes. So save changes async, and After this line, you would see the new note row inside the notes table. And finally, we can return true or false or something like that. But a good RESTful practice is to actually return a created response, which is a 201 HTTP. So we will say return created at action, and it takes a few parameters. It takes the string of the action name, and action name would be this because we want to pass the complete location to this newly created resource. So I will first assign this an action name, and in strings I will use the same name, which is get note by ID. And now I can say name of get note by ID, and then it needs the object values, the route values, and finally the value itself. So the route value of this one is ID. So I will first pass it inside a new object with the name of ID, and the value is this ID over here. And I will pass all the newly created object as well, which is the note itself. So if this was saved successfully, it would return this successful response of 201. And in the headers of that response, you will see the location to this newly created resource. And when we test this, when we test all of this using Swagger, I'll let you know what I'm talking about. So we have created the add method as well. Now it's time to create the update method. And the update method in HTTP RESTful APIs is an HTTP put method. So HTTP put, and the route for this one would be similar to the single ID route. We are updating a resource that has an ID of this. So that's why we are giving it a specific route. And then we will use public async task of I action result, and we will call our method update note. Update because in CRUD, U stands for update, and the first property it will take is this ID field from the route. So we will say in brackets from route, and I will call this, it's a parameter of GUID and ID. So the name should match whatever you're passing in the route. The second parameter it will take is the updated field. So updated notes property, which will be from body, and it's of type note, and I can call this updated note, right? And inside the brackets, we will now write our method. So we want to first check if this ID exists in our database or not, and only then we will try to update it. So first of all, using the same approach, I will find the ID inside the database. So I will say notes dbcontext.notes, try to find this using this ID. And if the note is null, that means it is unable to find this resource. I will return a not found back to the client. And then if it's found, let's update this. So we won't be updating the ID because it's a unique identifier, but we will update all the other fields. So update this dot title. Sorry, we want to update the existing note. We can call this existing note, and we want to change the existing note's title, which is coming from the updated note.title. Similarly, we will have two more properties, one for the description and the last one for the is visible. So apart from the ID, we are updating everything else. And after the update, we want to save our changes. So you don't have to call this.notes.update or anything. It automatically tracks that this is coming from the database. So now you just have to call the save changes async. So using the notes DB context, I can call the save changes async and await on this one. So after this line, the changes coming for our note will get updated to our database. And finally, we can return an OK response of the updated object, which is still the existing note. So this completes our update method as well. And the last action method is the delete, which in CRUD is the last D for delete. So as you can guess it, it takes the HTTP delete keyword, and the route is the same because we want to delete a single resource with that ID. So I will create the method public async task of action result delete note, and all it takes is the ID. So I can say from route is of type GUID, and the name should match the name of the route. And using this ID, I will try to find it again. So I can copy this from the previous method. Only if this note exists in our database, we will try to delete it. So if it doesn't exist, that means existing note is null, then return not found. And if it was found, then let's delete it. I will call await the DbContext dot notes, and I will use the remove method and pass the existing note to this remove method. So you have to pass the whole object that is coming from the database. Let's see why it's throwing an error, because remove is not an async method. We can't use the await keyword. We have to use it like that, and after that you can use the await keyword to save the changes to the database. So save changes async, and after that at this line the note with this ID is deleted from the database. And finally we can return an OK response, or you can say a no content response, which is a 204. You can just say OK, and that's it. So our delete method is now finished as well. It's now time to test all the created action methods using Swagger. I have run my application. As you can see, Swagger is running for us. Swagger is basically a client that you can use to basically call your API. You can use Postman, which is another popular client, but because Swagger now comes out of the box for ASP.NET Core, it's really easy to use Swagger. So we will first call the get method, because if I show you the database, if I select on the notes, on the table, I'll say select top 100,000 rows, whatever, and it's empty at the moment. So I can do this. It's empty at the moment, and we will fetch all the notes, and I would expect it to return an empty list. So it's trying to connect to the database, and it's giving me a successful response, which is a great thing. Our application is running correctly, but it's returning an empty response, which is also expected because we don't have any rows inside our database. So the first thing we should do is to actually add a new note inside our application. And using the post method, which is the add method, I will click on try it out. I actually don't need the ID, so I can get rid of it. Or actually I'll keep it because it's not nullable, I guess. So I'll keep the ID for now, but our application is going to update it. For the title, I will say this is my first note. And then in the description, I will say this is the description to my first note. And is it available is it visible to the client application? The default is true. We'll keep it like that. And if I execute this, it gives me a 201 created response, which is again 200 series is a success response. So the creation has been successfully finished, we believe, and the response body of this is this. So you can see the ID was replaced because we gave it a different ID, but it came back with a different ID. So that's good. And the reason, if I show you the API again, the reason for doing a created add action was because if you look at the headers now, response headers, the location has a string. If I copy the string and use it directly in my browser, it actually gives you the result of the note as well. So it gives you the actual location from which you can get access to this resource or this note. So that's how, in a RESTful API, it's important to have the add method to send a 201 created back. So that worked, but let's quickly go to the database to check if it actually saved that or not. If I click execute again, you can see the note was created inside the DB and we have one note. So we should be able to now call the get all notes again. So I'll click on execute and you can see it brings back the one created note. If I copy the ID and if I try to test the get single note by ID, so I'll click on try it out and pass the ID and click execute, it also gives me the correct result. So this method, which brings this single note, also works. Now it's time to test the remaining two, which is the put and the post and the delete. So put basically means to update, and let's give the ID of the note that we want to update and also the body. So I'll copy the body from here because I executed it just now. So I can pass it over here, and instead of saying this is my first note, I'll say this is my first updated note, and same to the description, first updated note. And let's make it a visible of false just to see if all the properties are getting updated. And if I click execute, brings back a 200, which is a good news, and it gives me the response body. But just to confirm, we'll use this notes by ID method again, and we get the updated results back from the database. So it's all working correctly. Finally, it's time to delete this ID. So I have to pass the ID property, which is a GUID. And as you can see, if I try to sending some other information, it just tells me that it has to be a valid GUID. So I send it to valid GUID, click on execute, and it does delete it for us. There's no content because we don't have any content. If this gives a 200, that means the resource, which is notes, has been deleted. And if I try to delete it again, it should give me a 404, which is not found. So obviously it was not found because we have deleted the resource. So our methods, the CRUD operations for our API, are working correctly now. Now it's time to create our JavaScript side of things and actually create our JavaScript client and hook this with our .NET API.